What's up everyone? Welcome to Blades with Roberto. Today we're going to be talking about the second knife in my collection. It is the CRKT M16. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So before we get started with the video, I just wanted to put the specs on the screen so you guys can take a look at it. Now, before we get started with the video, I just wanted to paint a little picture for you guys on how I got this knife. So, I grew up in northern New Mexico, and every weekend or every other weekend, my family and I would drive down to Santa Fe to go to the mall, go get groceries, and possibly stop at Big Five to get some sports equipment. So, picture little me back in 2009 going into Big Five and stumbling across the BB gun, pellet gun section where Big Five also carried knives. I just happened to stumble across this knife. I remember seeing this knife in the glass display, and back then at the time, it was again 2009, this knife was going for about $20. And I just was begging my parents to buy me this knife. So, long story short, it was easier to convince my dad to get a knife than my mom. So, eventually I convinced her to get the knife for me. So I got this knife, and I just wanted to start out with basically just kind of breaking it down, showing you guys basically from the blade to the grips. So, right off the bat, you're gonna see CRKT on one side of the blade, and on the other side you're going to see Carson Design M16 10Z and the patent number right underneath it. I wanted to give you guys a couple of quick little notes on Kit Carson. Kit Carson was the designer. The M16 was also named one of the top 10 tactical folders of the decade by Blade magazine. And Kit Carson was also inducted into the Cutlery Hall of Fame in 2012. The M16 originally released in 1999, and unfortunately Kit Carson passed away in 2014. Shout out to the late Kit Carson. He turned out and designed a bunch of amazing knives, and I just think it's pretty cool to have one of his knives in my collection. So let's go ahead and get started with the blade itself. So off the bat, you're gonna see this is a Tonto blade with serrations. The blade steel is gonna be 8CR 13 MOV, and the finish on this is gonna be a bead blast finish. You're also gonna get jimping on the lower spine of the blade, where your thumb would most likely rest. And you also have a flipper that has a bit more of an aggressive jimping on it than on the spine. The other thing that this flipper does is it also acts as a finger guard when fully open. So as you can tell, covers my finger. The thumb studs themselves are also knurled along with the pivot screw. So you can technically open this knife with your thumb. You just have to angle it at a certain angle in order to open it with your thumb. The pivot screw is also knurled and also has a flat head designed to loosen or tighten the pivot. And the one thing about this pivot as well is, as I mentioned earlier, it is knurled, which if you don't have a flathead screwdriver at the time, you can also use your thumb to kind of tighten that pivot in the meantime until you can get a screwdriver. That's what I've had to do myself when carrying this knife. The last thing I wanted to mention was the thumb studs also act as a blade stop when you open the knife. As you can tell, the grips themselves are going to have a shoulder right here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll try and get a better angle of it. But yeah, when you open it, the blade and the thumb studs rest flush with the grips on the shoulders. Moving on to the grips themselves, The grips are made out of glass-filled nylon, and it also has open holes within the handles themselves to lighten the grips. Now, the other screws that are on the grips are going to be all T6 screws, and you're also going to have steel liners in here in the grips, and you're also going to have a steel pocket clip. This is technically a deep carry pocket clip, but it pokes out of your pockets just ever so slightly. Moving on to the feature that I love the most about this knife is called the automated liner safety. So what CRKT has done on this knife is it's added this lever, this safety lever here in red. And basically what that is its own secondary safety or its own secondary lock. So traditionally you would pinch the liner inward to close the knife or close the blade, but on this knife, in order to close the knife itself, you have to pull on the lever, and that'll move over the safety, so you're able to move the liner to the side and eventually close the blade. So for any of you parents out there that are looking to get a knife for your teenagers or younger adults, I think this knife for the price is definitely worth considering to giving your kids. I think that's a pretty cool feature, especially if they're getting into knives. You know, having a secondary lock I think would be good for them to practice with. So it's pretty easy to do. What I do is I get my middle finger and I pull the safety lever down, and with my thumb I push the liner lock out, and then with my index finger I close the knife all at the same time. It does take a little while to get used to, especially if you're used to just a standard traditional liner lock, but overall it's a really great knife. It's pretty easy to learn that secondary safety feature. So let's go ahead and go on to the pros and cons. One thing I forgot to mention was where this knife was made. So on CRKT's website, it doesn't indicate where they're from or where their knives are made, which I thought was kind of weird. But I was able to Google search it, and I could be wrong on this, but from what I found was this knife is made in China, but CRKT is based out of Tualatin, Oregon. So I might have butchered that. I'm sorry. Comment down below if I did. But that was the most amount of information I could find in terms of where CRKT is made out of. So onto the pros. The very first thing that I love about this knife is it's a Tonto blade. Now keep in mind, this was the second knife in my collection, so this was a different blade style for me. Originally I had this drop point style blade, so now I got a Tonto. Now back then I didn't think much of a Tonto. All I thought was it was really cool and it looked tactical, so that's what attracted me to it, so that's why I loved it. The other thing that I love about this is the serrations. I don't know why a lot of people are not attracted to serrations or they don't like serrations, but I do. It's a plus for me. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just the size. So keep in mind, this was the second knife in my collection, and compared to the first knife, this knife overall length is 6 inches versus 7 inches on the CRKT. So having a longer grip and a longer blade was really nice for me back then. Nowadays, my hands have grown to be even bigger than this knife itself, so I kind of have to squish all 4 fingers into the grips. The next thing I like about this knife is going to be the knurling on the thumb studs and the pivot screw themselves. This is something that I haven't seen in any other knife in my collection that I currently have, and I think it's such a really cool idea. The knurling on here is really good. It's like the perfect amount of aggression for me in terms of knurling. Kind of reminds me of a new barbell when it has new knurling on it kind of feel. So I love the knurling on the pivot screw, mainly because if I'm in a pinch and I don't have the right tool to tighten the pivot screw on this knife, I can use the knurling and my thumb on there enough for me to just apply enough pressure to turn it and tighten it until I can find a flathead screwdriver. So that's a plus for me. The automated liner lock is also a plus. Again, guys, like I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for a knife for your kiddo, that's maybe a teen or someone that's getting their first knife, this knife is the best bang for your buck in my opinion. Now, currently, as at the time of me recording this video, they are not $20 anymore. That was back in 2009. I think nowadays they're about $50, roughly around that area. So check out the CRKT website or check out Blade HQ to see how much these are. And the last thing I'll note is the deep carry pocket clip. So my first knife also had a deep carry pocket clip, but on this guy it's a little just angled, if you will. So technically speaking, it is a deep carry pocket clip, but it's angled a little lower, so it kind of peeks out of my pocket a little. I'm not the biggest fan of that, but the clip itself is very comfortable and the coating on it has lasted really good. I mean, there's very minimal wear on this clip, and I've dropped this thing on so many surfaces that I'm surprised it's not as beat up as it is. On to the cons. The flipper itself and the pivot are kind of iffy. So sometimes you'll get a perfect action like that, but sometimes if you don't catch the flipper right, you'll get like half stops or not fully engaged actions, which is kind of annoying. Sometimes you have to use inertia to flip to fully open it, which is kind of annoying. The next thing I wanted to mention was the jimping on the spine. I'm not a big fan of. I wish it was more aggressive. I like aggressive textures, so if this could have been more aggressive, that would have been a plus for me. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the circles in the grips. I like the design and I understand why it's there, but I don't like how much gunk gets stuck in these circles. And it's really hard to clean out. You almost have to take the whole knife apart in order to get all of the gunk out of the circles. And the next thing I wanted to talk about was just the size overall. I mentioned it earlier, but back then when I first bought the knife, it fit my hands perfect. Now, not so much. I have to squeeze all 4 fingers into the grips themselves in order to get a full grip. So I've just outgrown the knife, so I don't know if you'd really consider that a con. The next thing I wanted to mention was when I took this knife apart, there's an O-ring behind this pivot screw and it was pinched. Now, I'm pretty sure that was my fault. This wasn't the first time I have taken this knife apart, so the O-ring being pinched is my fault, but the pivot itself I found backs out a lot, especially when I carried it recently, and it was just kind of disappointing. I had to keep using my finger to tighten the pivot screw back, which was kind of annoying. So I think if you maybe throw some Loctite in there, that would help prevent that once you get the blade centered. And the next thing I wanted to talk about for cons is the blade centering itself. So I've actually tried my best to center this blade and I can't center it to save my life. And if I do center it, it's to the point where the pivot is so tight that I can't even open the knife with like an inertia flick. So blade centering is not great on this knife. That pretty much sums up this video. Guys, before I end this video, I did want to mention one thing. So I am a huge fan of The Honest Outlaw on YouTube. He is a gun YouTuber, so I suggest you go follow him if you're into that stuff. But one thing that he does in his videos that I want to apply to my videos are he gives shout outs to the local homeless shelters, and I want to start doing something similar but with animal shelters. So make sure to check your local animal shelters if you're considering getting a pet. I know a lot of people like to buy their own pets through breeders and get fully bred pets, but also keep in mind I live in Texas and there are kill shelters, which means basically once an animal has been with a shelter for a certain amount of time and they can't push them through the system and find a home for them, they have to euthanize them. So I just want to spread awareness to animal shelters. So it is getting to be around that time of the year where people get gifts, the holidays are coming up. So before you consider purchasing a purebred animal, just check your local animal shelters too. If I could save all the animals in the animal shelters, I would, but unfortunately I live in an apartment and I just don't have the room for more. So you probably just saw my cat climb up behind me. We also saved her from the animal shelter. We have 2 cats, so that's my spiel, guys. So keep that in mind, consider animals in the shelters, and that's pretty much it. So thank you very much for watching this video, guys. I hope to see you guys in the next one, and take care.